So thank you for having me. It's a honor to be able to speak at the Tapia Center webinar. And so today, what I'd like to talk about are career choices after surviving grad school. And so oftentimes we spend a lot of time as grad students thinking about just getting through grad school. And so I'd like to just spend some time and talk about if you're getting your PhD, all the different options that you have that maybe you did not consider um, once you finish your PhD. And so that's what we'll talk about today. And I'm happy to take any questions at any time. Feel free to send those questions, type those in. I'll look at those. I'll read the question, and then I'll go ahead and answer it. So let's get started. So just a little bit of background. Some was already mentioned. I did complete my BS, MS, and as well as my PhD in computer science at Rice University. So I've been here for a while. So after I completed my degree, I decided to leave the campus for about 8 years and worked at Texas Instruments and had a couple of different roles. First 5 years, I basically spent the time as a software engineer and worked on in the compiler group on a number of projects. And from there, I stayed in the compiler group and was able to become a software development manager starting in 2013, and did that for about 3.5 years. And during this time, so TI was really flexible and allowed me to teach part-time. And so I had an opportunity while I was working at Texas Instruments to teach part-time, both at Texas Southern University, which I taught there for about 4 years, and I would teach Intro to CS class each semester. And then I got the opportunity spring of 2016 to teach part-time at Rice, and it ended up turning into a full-time summer appointment starting the summer of 2016. So, now I'm back at Rice on the campus. I'm glad to be back, and I'm here full-time, and I'm enjoying it. This is my first full year. And so, because I've worked in both industry and academia, I kind of wanted to kind of give my perspective of the options again that are available to those who are completing their PhD. And so, again, I want to kind of set the foundation for what I'm going to talk about and the expectations. So, I'm not going to be pro academia or pro industry. I believe that each has its pros and cons, and simply kind of what I want to do is really just share an experience from working in both sectors. And I don't claim to have the position that applies to all industry jobs or all academic jobs. And so I just kind of want to give my perspective and kind of share some insights that I've learned over these essentially past 8 or 9 years. And again, feel free at any time to interrupt me and feel free to ask questions. So I wanted to start with industry. Again, I worked at Texas Instruments, the location in Sugar Land, which is a suburb of Houston, and worked there for 8 years. And so I wanted to kind of start by talking about the environment of working in industry for if you're considering industry as a potential place of employment. And so some of this I think is probably well known, and some other things maybe you haven't thought about. So my goal here is just really kind of to give you a picture of what it could be like to work in the industry, and maybe point out a few things that you might not be aware of. And so certainly in industry there's lots of different opportunities, lots of different types of industry jobs. You can work on development teams, you can do research. It's just really kind of up to you. And a lot of times in industry there are multiple opportunities to do either or a combination of the two. Often there's flexibility in moving around an organization, so you're not tied to one specific group. So you can come in one group, work there a number of years, and then see something else that might be either slightly different or drastically different from what you're currently doing, and have the ability to switch to a different group. Probably some people would label the work schedule as a pro, um, meaning that you have kind of like your 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. You have your evenings and your weekends free, and you're not expected to work on weekends, which is good. It's in comparing to from looking at both academic and industry position. Some would, and I would argue that it's probably easier to get promoted, and you can sometimes get promoted faster than you could if you're in a kind of tenure track position. And there's different types of promotions, and I think sometimes we don't realize that even in industry there's kind of different tracks that you can take. And so typically there's at least two. One is a management track, where you could be a technical manager or even a non-technical manager, where you decide that you want to focus kind of more on project management, or you could take a technical ladder track. And typically what happens there is you may decide, for example, that hey, I want to be an expert in this particular field, but I don't want to deal with the management of people in a formal sense. I think all of us will have to manage in some informal manner, but you don't want to be a formal manager. And so there's actually kind of like a technical track. At TI, we had a technical ladder, and you could go down the technical track and get recognition there. And so what happens is basically over time, you're looked at as an expert in a particular field, and you have a technical ladder that you're climbing. And typically, as you go higher, there's less of a percentage of the workforce is a part of that ring for. And so it's a kind of a great way to be recognized as kind of one of the technical leaders. And again, it's you may not want to be a manager, but you still want to be kind of recognized in terms of achievements, and the technical ladder is certainly one way to do that. So sometimes one of the things that comes with being promoted is if you're with a company that is at multiple locations, you may have to relocate, and that certainly happens. I see when you go higher up in management, often you're asked to relocate. So at TI, for example, our headquarters was in Dallas, and so oftentimes when people were being promoted, you had to be willing to relocate. And so that's something that you want to think about if you're interested in the management track. It could mean, for example, that you might have to move to wherever headquarters is. TI, we had our headquarters was in Dallas, and we had about 10,000 employees there. So certainly, as you continue to go up the management track, you may be, as you're promoted, which is a good thing, you may also have to relocate. So you have to be sometimes willing to do that in industry. One of the nice things about working in industry is you publish if you want to. You don't have to. So it's not this field or an environment where you publish or perish. It's okay if you decide, well, I just want to do development, or I want to do research, but maybe I don't want to submit work to a particular conference, or maybe I do that occasionally and not multiple times a year. And so the thing to keep in mind, though, is if you are considering at some point in the future of returning to academia in a tenure track position, then at that in that place, you would want to consider making sure that you're doing research and consistently doing research. And that always kind of opens the door to returning to academia in a tenure track position. As I'll talk about, I did return back to academia, not in a tenure track position, but in a non-tenure track position as a lecturer. And so in that case, you're not required to keep up with research at that point. So it's kind of up to you, but that's one of the things to keep in mind. So feedback in industry. The dominant way that you get feedback comes from your performance reviews, which you might be familiar with. So there's typically a mid-year or end of year. And, the end of year is where you kind of look at what did you accomplish and what did you say you were going to accomplish, and did you actually accomplish the things that you said you were going to accomplish? Okay? And then you get feedback there. And a lot of times, bonuses and stock options and things like that are tied to that performance review. If you're looking at the difference between industry versus academia, I can definitely say there's higher compensation in industry. I'm very aware of that. But you typically have less autonomy, meaning that the company is going to set the direction of what they think is most important for you as an employee to be working on. And that's going to trickle down to management. It's going to trickle down to software developers, and so that's set by management at a high level, the senior vice presidents and president CEO. Okay, but as you go into academia, particularly if you have a research position, you have more autonomy in setting the research agenda and what you're going to work on. So it just kind of depends on which way you want to go there. And what I've noticed, particularly while I spent time at Texas Instruments, is the best way to secure a full-time position is through a summer internship. When we're looking at who we're going to hire full-time, the first thing we thought about are who are our interns that did a good job, and those were the first people that we made offers to. And so we did that before we considered anybody outside of our interns. And so if you're interested in a particular company, I definitely would highly and strongly recommend that you do a summer internship with that company. It's looked at as cheap labor, honestly, particularly if you're a grad student. It's compared to what you would get paid as a full-time employee. It's going to be a lot less, even though as a grad student it may feel like a lot, but it's a lot less than what you would make as a full-time employee. And so it's seen as a great way to at kind of low cost kind of try out the person to see if they are a good fit for the company. And then of course it's a 3-month commitment, and so it's not a big commitment. And so I would highly recommend, if at all possible, if you know you want to go into industry and you know that there's a particular company you're interested in, I would definitely spend a summer, even though I know that might make the time that you graduate a little bit longer, but I think it's highly valuable and worth it to get that experience, particularly when you're in grad school. And I was able to do a summer internship in Seattle for a company called Cray. Spent 3 months there, and the nice thing about that, it was a research position, so I was able to get a paper out of that. So you got better pay than I would have gotten paid as staying at Rice over the summer, and I got a paper out of it, and it helped for my dissertation, and so that was a win-win for me. So there's a question. The question is, how would you make the most out of your internship? Or how do you make the most, or how do you stand out during an internship? So that's a great question. So as an intern, you're typically given some problem, and as a grad student, typically, the problem that you're given a lot of autonomy in working through that problem. And so, it's really a trial where they're trying to see, is this the type of person who can take a problem, and it's not like you can't ask for help. You certainly can ask for help, but is this a person who is able to, on their own, take some portion of a larger problem and take ownership of it, and using the technical expertise that they have, are they able to solve the problem in that 3 month time frame? And if you can do that, you can do it well, and you can come up to speed quickly on what the problem is, and you can solve it and make a good contribution, in that 3 months. That's going to be a great way to stand out. Because typically the problem that you're given is one where, if you're a grad student, it's one where it's going to take you a while to come up to speed just on the problem itself. And so one, they're trying to see, can you come up to speed quickly on the work that you're being given? And then can you, solve the problem and make a good contribution? And so if you can do those things, and you can do that in 3 months, you're going to leave a great impression and stand out. And certainly that's what we experienced with the interns that we brought in at TI. We saw a person who was able to really just jump on the problem, take ownership of it, come up to speed quickly, and do a really good job at solving the problem. And that might mean, it doesn't mean that they're not asking for help. It doesn't mean that they don't need a lot of help. But they're motivated. You can tell that they're smart by how quickly they're able to grasp the problem and the solution that they come up with. Those are the people that, honestly, we're gonna be thinking about immediately. How do we make them a full-time offer? So that's a great question. Okay, so I want to talk about often a favorite subject, which is compensation. And I want to talk about how compensation works, particularly in industry. So as a graduate with a PhD, typically what we typically see is salaries that start around 100K, and that's excluding the signing bonus. So typically there's if a company really wants you, they're going to give you a salary that's competitive, and then they're also going to give you a signing bonus. That's kind of standard, and it doesn't mean that they don't want you if they don't offer you a signing bonus. And so don't. That's not the message, but certainly a signing bonus is one of the ways that is often used to indicate that we really are trying to get you to work for our company. Okay, so you can typically expect something around there, but that's certainly not the only thing that you want to look at. Certainly that's one thing. So your salary, of course, I'm sure is important to you after you spent 5, 6, even more years. So I spent 6 years in grad school, so I'm okay saying that. And so I know people spend less, people spend more. And so after 6 years, of grad school, you might be looking for a bump in salary. And so you look at that, that starting salary and the signing bonus, and you get excited about that. But there are other things that you want to be thinking about, particularly as you begin your career. So of course, things like how much vacation, those things are important. 401k match. So 401k match, if you don't know, it's basically a retirement incentive where you put a certain amount of money towards retirement, and just depending on the company, a company may say, I'll match 4% of your salary, at 100%. So if you put away, let's say you make 100,000, you put away 4,000, they're going to match that. So you have 8,000 put in retirement. So it's free money. You definitely want to match up into that level that they're willing to match you. You have profit sharing, and so profit sharing is really interesting. So basically, what the company says is, if we're profitable, uh, you're going to get some of the benefit of that. And so the way that they do it is there's a certain level of profitability that they will say, we've got to reach this level of profitability. So maybe that's 10%, maybe it's 20%. And so if we're profitable at that level, then you start reaping some of the benefits. Okay, and it could be significant. Certainly at TI there were the good years. The good years where we would see something like 2 months of pay, additional 2 months of pay just from profit sharing. Okay, so you can imagine, let's say your salary is 90,000, then you're gonna have an additional check of like 15,000. So that's pretty significant. Okay, and so profit sharing, I can tell you, is a great motivator. People, are looking to do well so that they can, or looking for the company to do well so that they can, enjoy some of the benefits. Raises. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about what companies do to retain talent. Okay, and so certainly one of the things that you'll see is a raise. Typically at the end of the year, you'll get you'll get some type of raise, and it's normal to get something. If the company's losing money, so if it's a bad year, then maybe in that case you might not see a raise. But typically in a good year, when the company's done well, you'll see some type of raise. And 0 to 3% is typically normal. So here's what I'll say: even if you didn't do that well, you still might get a raise between 0 and 3%, and greater than 0%. Okay, and really kind of the takeaway from that is that a company doesn't want to demotivate you. So even if you're not doing great, we don't want to give you an incentive to do worse. And so we're going to give you something. Okay, and so the reason why I mentioned that is because you don't want to look at the raise that you got and say, hey, I got a 2% raise. They must really want me around. Typically, what that means is 0, 1 to 2%. That's just what we normally will give. Okay, if they really want to retain top talent, they typically will give raises that are higher than 3%. And again, this is, you want to look at this as these are the good years. Now in a bad year, you might get like a 3% raise, and that actually might be a really good raise in a bad year when the company's lost money. But we're talking when things are going well, and they're really trying to retain talent. Oftentimes, what they'll do is they'll give a average raise of 4% or higher, and you might. So normally raises happen at the end of the year, but if you really are trying to retain a particular individual, you might actually give a mid-year raise. And so that typically would happen. So that might happen in June. So you're saying, hey, this particular individual is really someone we want to keep around. Let's go ahead and give a raise early. Let's give it a mid-year raise just to let them know that, hey, you're really doing a great job, and we really want to make sure that you're aware of that. So also a couple other things you'll do if you're trying to retain top talent. One, you'll give maybe an annual bonus. So when you come onto the company, you get a signing bonus. But sometimes what you want to do is you want to reward somebody who had a really good year. And so you can do that in a number of ways. And so typically the ways that it's done is you give them some type of bonus, which says, hey, for this year, for what you did, you really went above and beyond what we expected you to do, and so we're going to give you a bonus. So, if you're not getting these things, it doesn't mean that you're not top talent. But this is just honestly, from working, particularly in management, these are the things that it's talked about. Who's the top talent? Want to make sure that they're getting the bonuses. And another thing that they'll do, a company do, is they'll give stock options. And so stock options basically are an incentive for you to stay at the company. Okay? And so the way stock options work essentially is that we're going to give you, a number of options. Let's say we give you 100 stock options. And typically with the stock options, there's a vesting period. So the vesting period might be 4 years. So the normal stock options, if it's a vesting period of 4 years, you'll have a percentage that vests every year. So if I've got 100 stock options, maybe 25 vest every year. Okay? And so if I really want to keep somebody and let them know that I really want them to stay at a company, not only will I give them stock options, but I'll give them what's called restricted stock options. So the normal stock option, let's say that the value of the stock option when you got it was $30. Let's say in a year it went up to $40. So normal stock option, if it vests, that means you made $10 a share. Okay, so if you got 100 shares at $10 a share, that means you made $1,000. A restricted stock option means that whatever that value is, so if we went to from $30 to $40, and if it vests, that means you get the whole $40. Okay, so it's restricted. Restricted usually means that it's going to be a longer period of time that it will vest. So your normal stock option might invest partially every year. Your restricted stock option, because that's such a great incentive, it may not vest for 4 years. And so it's really the company's saying, we really want you to be here kind of like long term. And so those are really great to get. Okay, so that's just a little bit about compensation. So one of the things that I really wanted to talk about, I wanted to talk about some of the unwritten rules. So these are the things that the company is not going to tell you, but I think are really good to know. Okay, so as an employee, and again, so at the beginning of the talk, one of the things I said is I'm not saying that every company works this way, but certainly there are a group of companies that work this way. When you come into a company, particularly at a let's say you got your PhD and now you're coming into the company, there's a level of expectation. There's expectation that you're going to do well. There's an expectation that you're going to be a technical leader, and so there is an expectation. Okay, and so it's the way there's an expectation is you have probably a higher starting salary than someone who comes in with a bachelor's degree. Okay, and that's an easy way to know we're paying you more, so we're expecting more. So one of the things that happens is, and this is really not talked about, is that there's a ranking, particularly so maybe you're in a group of 50. There is a ranking that occurs, and it's generally done by management, where they rank the employees in that group. Okay, and so typically what will happen is a group will have a certain amount of money that you can at the end of the year pay in bonuses, pay in stock options, and maybe even pay in terms of higher raises. And so you'll use that ranking to kind of determine how to divvy up those bonuses and stock options. And that ranking could also be used for promotion as well into management or higher up the technical ladder. Okay, so that's the good reason why they do the ranking. Okay, so the not so good reason why the rankings are done as well is for if there happens to be layoffs. So unfortunately in industry, one of the cons of working in the industry is layoffs will happen, and they will happen, and it's unfortunate, but it is a part of life. And honestly, it only takes, you could have 5 good years, 5 like really good years, and it only takes 1 bad year for management to consider, well, maybe we need to downsize. Okay. And so, what I've seen is that sometimes the way that layoffs work is, a group will have to lay off 15%. Okay, so this is 15% across the board. Okay, and so one of the ways that you can determine, who that 15% will affect is you use a ranking. So typically contractors are going to be the first to get laid off. So people that are not, employees of the company. Um, and then after that, you start laying off employees. Okay, so what they'll do is they'll take kind of like that bottom 15%, and that'll be the cutoff. Okay, and that's again it's unfortunate, but it happens, and I've seen it firsthand, and so it does happen, um, and so that's another reason why they will do a ranking. And so one of the things I want to communicate and make sure that I understand, no matter what you do. So again, I'm not saying necessarily I'm a proponent of you should go to industry or you should always go to academia. Whatever route you will take, just make sure that you do what you enjoy. I think that's the best way to kind of make sure that you put yourself in a position where you do the best you can to avoid, a layoff. I've certainly seen, cases where it seems like employees are there, just trying to work and just trying to, make sure that they get to retirement, but didn't necessarily enjoy what they did. So you really, really want to make sure that you enjoy what you do, because I think it affects your performance. And certainly in the industry, things have changed. And so there's still people that work. I don't want to give the impression that no one works at a company 30 years anymore, but it certainly is not as common as it used to be. There's layoffs happen, and sometimes they're periodic, meaning that they can happen every 3 years, maybe even less. And so it's not safe, and so you want to make sure that you do everything you can to put yourself in the best position to be successful. Evaluations are always done, and the thing to note is when you're being compared and when you're being evaluated, you're not being evaluated. So if you've been at the company for 10 years and maybe you've climbed a little bit up the technical ladder, you're not going to be evaluated against somebody who just came into the company, someone who maybe had just graduated. Okay, you're going to be evaluated relative to your peers at your job grade. So that might be people that are not even in your group. Okay, and so again, it's very important to make sure that you're always doing things that you enjoy. You're always doing things that that motivate you to do the best that you can. So unfortunately, kind of I'll talk a little bit more about layoffs. It's really interesting. So being in management, I got to hear the reason why each individual, particularly that was in my group, why they were getting laid off. And so management tries to make sure that they communicate effectively with other managers why a person is let go. Okay, and I've heard a variety of reasons. Okay, I've heard everything from the person just technically wasn't working, making as much progress as they should have. I've heard this person is just really hard to get along with. I've also heard that the person makes too much money. Okay, and so typically what happens is again, as I was saying earlier, with the raises, that we're gonna give a raise regardless of how well sometimes that person is doing. So we may still give them a 2% raise. Okay, and so if they came in with a high salary and you're giving them 2 or 3% raises every year, then that's going to grow their salary, and so it's going to potentially get to a point where you feel like they're being overly compensated for the value that they give back in return. And so I've heard this person really makes too much money for what they do. Other reasons, a person didn't technically grow, so they came in and they didn't become kind of like an expert at what they were doing. And so that's another reason why if there's not growth, if someone's looked at as this person is going to be an expert in a particular area, and it turns out that they're a contributor, but they're not an expert, but they were being paid like they were going to be an expert. You may find that, that might be a reason. Um, so the people that tend to be excluded from layoffs tend to be, and this is, in practice, this is the case, and I'm not saying that, every company works this way, but when you're a new hire, you tend to get the benefit of the doubt. Okay, and so you as a company, I don't really know what I have, right? As a new hire, this person is still coming up to speed. They just got here. It's been less than 2 years. I can't really make a really good assessment. And so because of that, because of the fact that I just hired them, and honestly, it looks bad. I hire somebody and I lay them off, less than a year later. That doesn't look good. That doesn't look good for the company. Okay, and so typically new hires are excluded, and and managers tend to be excluded as well. Was what I find. So when you look at those rankings, managers tend to be, well, the managers are doing the rankings, and so they tend to rank themselves, high. Okay, so that's just the way things go. So those are some unwritten rules. So those are things to be aware of, particularly when you start your career. Okay, and again, I'm happy to take any questions related to that, or just any any questions related to working in industry in general. And so as I said, TI was really a flexible place to work. Gave me multiple opportunities to teach while I was working there, and so I spent half the time while I was at TI, I was teaching part-time. And so I started at Texas Southern University here in Houston, and then I was able to move on to Rice University as well. And so have lots of different experiences in terms of teaching. I'm working in academia in different positions. So I've worked as an adjunct, assistant professor, and I've been a part-time lecturer, and now I'm full-time lecturer. And so if you're thinking about academia, and I have to say is when I came to grad school, my belief is that I was coming to grad school to be a professor, and so that's why that was my motivation. So once I completed my degree, I began to kind of apply to both industry as well as academia, and because of personal reasons, I was limited into where I could apply in the sense from a location. I needed to stay in Houston, so I applied to both academic and industry positions in Houston. And so kind of making a switch and talking about academia, there's some great perks to being in academia. One, of course, is a flexible schedule. It's not as flexible as you would think it is. So there's always, of course, you're teaching courses. You've got office hours. If you've got classes with labs, then you've got labs. You're grading homework. Hopefully, you've got some help. So you've got some TAs that are also grading. So you're having grading parties, and so it's flexible, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be at home most of the time. You will be at work, which is good. However, in the summer, you do have a lot more flexibility. Okay, and as a faculty member, you don't. There's not so in industry, you come in and you start with maybe 2 weeks of vacation, and so as a faculty member, it's not like you get like a certain amount of vacation. You take as much as you want, and so that sounds like you can take a lot of vacation, but faculty members tend to be busy, and so they probably don't take as much as you think they would. But it's a nice perk that you can kind of take vacation as you want and when you want. And so probably typically in the summer, there's more flexibility in doing that. One of the great things about academia is the flexibility as well as the autonomy. And so I said in industry, you're kind of restricted to, what's going to bring you profit. What are you the expert in terms of the company? Where do you have kind of the share of the market? That's where you're going to focus on trying to get profit and trying to bring in revenue. And so as a researcher in particular, you have autonomy. Now it's not complete autonomy. So when you're hired, and we're doing faculty, we're bringing in faculty candidates right now in the computer science department. We're looking for particular areas, okay? And so when we're bringing people in, we see that they're an expert in this particular area, and it's an area where we see a need in terms of our department. So it's a way to kind of enhance our department. And so the expectation is if we hire that person, then they're going to be doing research in that area. Okay, and so you have autonomy kind of within your expertise or in the research area in which we bring you in. Now you do get more freedom after you get tenured. So you can take more chances and particularly take chances outside of your research area if you choose so after that. So job security, so there's both tenure track and non-tenure track positions. So in academia is probably one of the last places where you really have really good job security. So assuming that you get tenured, at that point, it's very hard to get rid of that person. Okay. Now the tenure track professor tends to have a lot of responsibility. So I kind of see it as a person that's starting a small business. You have so much to manage. You've got to manage budgets, grad students, research, your staff, your grants. A lot of times you're writing grants with co-PIs or principal investigators, and that takes a lot of time. You've got a lab. You've got lab equipment. You've got a lot to manage. Okay, and so. You have flexibility, you have autonomy, but there's a lot of responsibility. Okay, and so that's why I always say that it's very important, even in choosing a position in academia to do what you enjoy, because you will always be evaluated. And even, the interesting thing is even tenured professors are currently still being evaluated by their peers. And we have faculty meetings where we'll sit and talk, and we'll talk about, what it means to do your part and what it means to do your share and what it looks like if you're not doing your share. And so it's obvious that, when somebody's, when people feel that you're not doing your part, I'll say that. Okay, and so even though you may be tenured, okay, you're still being evaluated, particularly by your peers. So that's one thing I'd say to keep in mind. Okay, so you've always got to be doing things that you enjoy, things that motivate you. It's very important. Okay, so a couple more slides, and then again, I'm willing to take any questions, or you can ask questions at any point. So compensation. So if you're interested in going into academia, so compensation is I've seen kind of a wide variety, and it varies widely, I would say, from institution to institution. And so, I'm not going to name institutions, but it's a fact. I'll say that you can be a lecturer, at one school, so a non-tenure track position, and you could make more than an assistant professor, so a tenure track position at another school. So typically you would expect the lecturer to make less, right? Because they're not doing research, okay? So they're teaching teaching only, so they're only teaching courses. But it just varies, and there are many factors that will determine what type of compensation package you will get. And so you've got to really do your homework. It depends on whether the institution is public or private, research versus teaching, It depends on the type of position that you're seeking. So I talked about being a lecturer, that's a non-tenured track position versus a tenured position. It's going to vary by department. So it'll vary by department within a school, and it'll vary by department across universities. Okay, and then it's also could be subject to publicly like state-funded school. There might be a cap that's set on a salary. And so there's a lot of different factors that you'll have to keep in mind and think about. So typically, I talked about when you think about a compensation package in industry, you want to think about more than just your salary. And the same thing holds for if you're thinking about like a tenure track position. You want to look at the starting package. Okay, so it's not just your 9-month salary. Okay, so in academia, you have a 9-month salary, and typically you'll have the option to stretch it over a 12-month period. So it doesn't feel like, well, I'm getting paid for 9 months, and then these 3 months I'm not getting paid. What am I going to do? That's not probably a good thing to bring home to your spouse. Okay, so I typically choose the 12-month period, so it looks like I'm always getting paid, and to my spouse it may look like I'm always doing something that's bringing in a salary. Okay, but it is a 9-month salary, so you could take it as a 9 months. And then there's typically some type of support for staff, whether that's grad students, postdocs, or even a research scientist. And those are things you'd have to negotiate. And then there's also, depending on what type of research you're doing, you might need lab equipment, so there's lab support. And typically what they would do is they'll also give you some type of summer salary, at least for the first year. So you might get something like 2 months of summer support for the first year. And then after that, in that second year, you may be required to pull that support from a research grant that you have. The thing to keep in mind with academia as well as with industry, benefits are important and they matter. So you got to think about things like retirement. So when you're looking at comparing packages, you want to look at, well, how much is University A contributing to my retirement? Maybe they contribute 10%, where the University B only contributes 5%. To my retirement. And those are things to keep in mind. I'm not saying that those are things that are going to make or break one offer versus the other, but those are certainly things to keep in mind. Education. So Rice has a fantastic policy where staff of the university, if their children get into Rice, then they can go tuition free, which is a wonderful benefit. And so I have a 4-year-old and I have a 6-week-old, and I will be doing my best to try to convince them that Rice is the place where they need to go to school. Okay. The other things, childcare is important, of course, if you have kids, and so there's some universities that have childcare either on site or really close, and so those are really things that you want to think about it as well. So compensation is not just salary. Regardless of whether it's an academic position or an industry position, you've got to look at the full picture when you look at compensation, and you've got to look at the full picture when you're comparing compensation packages. Okay. The other thing that I want to mention, I think that often gets maybe a little bit overlooked, is when you're looking at academic positions, there are lots of different types of positions in academia. Okay, and so typically when people think about an academic position, and they think about the tenure track position, which is a wonderful position, a great position, where you start as an tenured assistant professor on the tenure track, and that's typically that's the position you would have if you're coming out of grad school. And now sometimes you have an outstanding researcher who is in industry and they're coming from industry into academia, and they may not start as an assistant professor, they may actually start as a full professor. But typically, coming out of grad school, you're going to start as an assistant professor, tenure track. Okay. The tenure process will vary by institution. It's typically based off of three areas: research, teaching, and service, and it is typically in that area, in that order. Okay, so when you come in as an assistant professor, you don't want to grab 10 different service opportunities right away. I mean, it's great that you want to jump in and do things for the university, but your focus should be research. And then after research, it should be teaching. And then after teaching, it should be service. And it should be in that order. Um, if you're great at teaching, but you're not good at research, and you're at a research institution, you're probably not going to get tenure. Okay, so research is most important. Courses, what I've seen, it varies. I've been a part of a couple of institutions. It certainly varies by institution. So you could have anything from one course per year to 4 courses per semester. Okay, and so when you're looking at offers, you've got to, of course, factor that in. If you're teaching 4 courses per semester and you're still expected to do research, it's going to be tough. But that's something you want to keep in mind. Okay, so outside of kind of what people think about the assistant, associate, full professor, there's many other positions. So as I said at the beginning, I'm currently a lecturer at Rice in the CS department. It's a non-tenure track position. Okay, and we've also just started what we call kind of teaching professor, and that's just getting started. And we're, as a university, we're trying to figure out what that looks like to be able to have people apply for those positions, even people that are currently lecturers. But that's also a non-tenure track position as well. In those cases, when you have non-tenure track positions, that means you're going to sign a contract. That length of contract, it may vary. It could be a year, it could be 2 years, 3 years. Typically, you have no summer commitment. So it's up to you to figure out what you're going to do over the summer. And you have the freedom and flexibility to kind of figure that out yourself. So some of the other positions, research professor. So research professor, you're not teaching, you're just doing research. You're being paid out of the grants you receive. So your primary responsibility is going to be writing grants, getting funded, and doing research. And you're going to be constantly in that cycle, okay? Because your pay is dependent solely on your research grants. So then you have your research staff, and so those are typically paid out of research grants as well. So a tenure track professor may have a research scientist or multiple research scientists, and maybe postdocs. Those have just graduated from receiving their PhD. They may be at an institution for 2 to 3 years before they move on to something else. Those are kind of research staff positions. So then you have what's called a visiting professor position. This is typically a short-term position, so 1 year. It's typically a teaching-only position, but it's meant to kind of sometimes they're used to kind of fill in the gaps when there's a lot of teaching. Maybe there's someone's going on sabbatical and they're not going to be there, and we need somebody to kind of fill in, and so you can have like a visiting professor. So it tends to be maybe either a semester or a year term, and they don't typically last more than 1 to 2 years. But the good thing about them is you do get benefits. So professor to practice is common even at Rice, where we bring in people who have had very distinguished careers in industry, and we bring them in. Oftentimes they've retired from that career, and they're looking to still kind of be involved in a way, and so this is an excellent opportunity for them to bring in their expertise into an institution of higher learning. And then the last thing is an adjunct. And so these are people that typically are teaching 1 course a semester. There are no benefits, so they're just salary. Okay, and so typically, an adjunct, oftentimes will be someone who has another job, and they're doing it for fun because they enjoy teaching. And so you typically teach like 1 course a semester. And then you have to be reappointed. So all non-tenure track positions, you have to be reappointed. An adjunct, it could be every semester or every year. And so I want to go ahead and stop there, and I'm willing to take any questions. So there's a question, do I have any advice on interviewing? So yes, so I do have advice on interviewing. So one one of the things that I would say is that even when going for a particular position, I would really, I talked about, one way is to get a position is to do an internship. One of the other ways to get a position, meaning that you're going into an interview, is, if you have or your university has like a particular connection. So let's say, for example, that you have Rice, we have a strong connection with like Texas Instruments, for example. And so because we have those connections, your advisor might have a connection with someone who works in the industry. And I would, say that you make sure that you understand those connections and that you're working those connections. So if you're particularly interested in maybe working at Texas Instruments, then you need to make sure that your advisor is working that connection on the TI side, because that's going to make the interview go a lot more smoother, because they're coming at it from a position of, well, this person has the job to lose versus this person is going in trying to get this job. Okay, so that's one of the things that I would say. Other advice on interviewing. Oftentimes there's there's kind of standard questions that get asked. So they may ask a question about, how to solve a problem in, a specific way. And they want to essentially see that you know how to attack a problem. And so you want to just kind of be familiar with, maybe get some practice problems that are often used. There's interview questions that typically asked, and so you can also always search around for questions that are typically asked at an interview, and just to give you an insight into what types of questions that are asked, and just kind of think about what are the ways that I would answer this specific question. But by and far, what I would say in terms of interview advice, because a lot of what it comes down to is when they're interviewing you, it's almost like a marriage. They're trying to figure out, I potentially might have to work with this person for 30 years, okay? And so, it's not just what they're trying to see, man, is this a good person that, that I think would work with our group in terms of personality. And so, you just want to make sure you put your best foot forward. But I think, in terms of advice I would give in terms of interviewing, if you've got a foot in the door when you go into the interview, I think that's going to be key. So there's a question, would you please describe the professor of the practice a little more? I have years of industry and government experience, but just completed my PhD last year. It says, I'm focusing now on job hunting in industry and government, but trying to plan for options in academia in the future. What qualifications are considered for professor of the practice? Great question. So it's generally the case, a professor of the practice is generally somebody, when I say they've had a distinguished career. So for example, to give you an example, so at TI, I talked about the tech ladder. So the tech ladder is, again, where you're recognized as a technical expert. And so you start out as, you're on the tech ladder, you get into tech ladder, and then you go up to like what's called like a senior technical position, distinguished technical position. And then after that, they have what's called a fellow. Okay, and so a fellow is really looked at as, a technical leader across the company. Those are the types of people, and I'm not saying that those are the only people, but those are the types of people when they finish their career, they're well known in the community. They're well known, oftentimes the university is, because they're doing research as well, then they're well known in the research community. They're well known in academia. And so those are the types of people that end up, transitioning into professor of the practice type positions. Okay, so there, you really want to make sure that if that's something that you're looking at, you want to be kind of looked at in your field as, particularly in your company, as one of the, technical leaders across the company, not just in your group. So these are people that are, experts across the company. Okay, and you hear their name, and most people know who they are. So another question, what are some key things to remember as far as dealing with negotiations after being given an offer? Excellent question. Um, so so one of the things you've got to keep in mind, you've got to have a position to negotiate. Okay, so when I say a position to negotiate, what I mean is that you're not in a good negotiating position until you have multiple offers. Okay, and you have to have multiple offers, each offer that you're willing to accept. Okay, so if you're in that position, that's a great position to negotiate. Okay, if you've only got one offer, you can always let's say they offer you like 90,000 starting salary. Okay, you can say I want 95. However, that doesn't sound as strong as you saying I've got company Y that's offering me 100K. Can you offer 95? Okay, that's a much better negotiating position. But that's only a good negotiating position. You can negotiate, but you want to make sure that I take the other offer. I take the 100K. Because when you negotiate, you've got to be careful. You don't want to be seen as, well, I'm just trying to get as much money as I can, and you are, but you just want to make sure when you say company X is giving me 100K, then that looks at like you're trying to make sure that you're fairly compensated. If you've just got one offer and you're saying that I've got 90 and I want 95, that might look like you just want more money. But if you got 90 and somebody's offering you 110, and you say I would like 100 because somebody else is offering me 110, then that looks a little bit different. That looks like you're trying to be fairly compensated, and so that's what I would keep in mind. Yeah, good questions. Any other questions? Feel free to ask anything. I'll wait a couple more seconds. Feel free to ask anything. Here's a question. Is it best from time to time to have your eyes on the market? So I'm assuming that question is you have a job and I see it says people are typing, so is it okay, so here's a question. Is it best from time to time to have your eyes on the market? So I'm assuming that question is you have a job and maybe you're looking to move. So the answer I would give is you always want to, yes, you want to be thinking about, okay, what else would I do if I weren't here? And the reason why I say that is because a lot of times when you never know, for example, in terms of like a layoff, if it's going to, you might not know if it's going to affect you. So you kind of always want to be thinking about like what's going on in the market, what are other things that maybe I could potentially do, and oftentimes, people, you've probably seen if you've got like a LinkedIn profile. You've seen recruiters where they'll try to see if you're interested in relocating. So sometimes I think it'd be good to not necessarily go into it with the fact I'm definitely going to really relocate, but just kind of really think about, okay, well, what's out there, what are they offering? Let me think about, what would I do if I weren't at this particular company? Um, and so, yeah, I think you from time to time you want to have your eyes on the market, and you want to think about, I always kind of had took the position of what would I do if I weren't working at TI, because I think it's important to think about that in case that, like, again, like I said, layoffs happen. So I think it's important to always be thinking about, what are other options that I could potentially have. So here's another question: how important is it to do is doing research to apply for grad school? So that's a really good question. So I think that what it's getting to is, do you need to do research to even apply to grad school? And so it's not necessary. I think it's great from the standpoint of you've gotten experience, and so you kind of know what you're walking into to some extent. But certainly, I mean, I had absolutely no research experience when I applied to grad school. I would say what's great is if you have a relationship, particularly with a particular professor. So maybe you've done well in the class. Particularly if you're going to go to grad school at the institution that you did your undergrad at. It's important to kind of, if you know a particular professor at the school, then that's great. And I think, what research does is it gives you an opportunity to build relationships with, professors. And so from that standpoint, I think it's great, but it's certainly it's not necessary. And there are a lot of people who go to grad school who didn't do research, as an undergrad.